Hi, I'm Childress. I'm a reporter for Frontline, and today I'm answering your questions about voting. Harlan Abraham writes, why doesn't every adult 18 and over have a government-issued ID? That's a great question. Let's think about what kinds of IDs are issued by the government. There's a social security card, there's your passport, there's a driver's license, there's a citizenship certificate, there's a military ID if you work for the military, and there's a non-driver's ID, usually issued by your state. So, social security card only has your name and your signature. It doesn't work for photo ID at the polls because it doesn't have your photo and it doesn't have a current address, so that's out. Passports are expensive, and less than half of Americans have one. A driver's license, well, if you don't drive or you don't have a car, you're not going to have one of those. A citizenship certificate, if you were born in the US, you don't have one of those. Obviously, a military ID is only for members of the military. That leaves us with non-driver's ID, and there's several barriers to getting one of those. One of them is your birth certificate, which you need in order to get this ID. Not everyone has a birth certificate. Sometimes those records have been lost or destroyed. Sometimes they're in other states. So getting that document can be difficult and it can be costly. So those are the kind of barriers that people experience when they try to get these kinds of IDs. And that might seem like a small population, but it turns out it's not. In Texas, for example, one of the most populous states in the country, the state estimated that 800,000 registered voters didn't have an ID. In North Carolina, it's 300,000. Wisconsin, 300,000. In Pennsylvania, it was about 500,000 voters that didn't have a proper ID at the polls. So a lot of you have asked about voter ID laws, asking why they're so controversial. What's the deal? The first reason they're so controversial is because they're partisan. They're overwhelmingly passed by Republicans and overwhelmingly criticized by Democrats. The second reason is the question of how effective they really are. Republican lawmakers who have passed these laws say they're doing so to stamp out voter fraud. The only kind of fraud that these laws actually stop is voter impersonation fraud. That's when someone goes to the polls and votes in the name of another eligible voter. That kind of fraud is really rare. Only about 3% of cases in one study that we looked at. Much more common is double voting, when someone votes as themselves in two different locations, or vote buying, when someone bribes or otherwise pays someone to vote for another candidate. And absentee ballot fraud is also much more prevalent, when people mail in ballots that aren't their own. The other reason this is a concern for many people is that some of them have been ruled to be discriminatory. It can be difficult for some people to obtain an ID. The state of Texas said that 800,000 registered voters did not have an ID that would be acceptable at the polls. In North Carolina, it's 300,000. Wisconsin, 300,000. In Pennsylvania, it was about 500,000 voters that didn't have a proper ID at the polls. Those voters tend to disproportionately be African American, Latino, elderly voters, low-income voters, and students, college-age voters.